Welcome and thank you for attending Black History Matters, presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. My name is Victoria Basulto, and I am a current senior at Colgate University located in Hamilton, New York, and a current intern for the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. I will be facilitating a series of 28 presentations that will be released throughout the month of February 2021 and that you can view on our YouTube channel or on our website. I will now lead you through some introductory statements. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is located in Peterborough, New York, in the building that you can see on the screen, where the inaugural meeting of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society was held in 1835. NAHOF's mission is as follows. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum honors anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery and the legacy of that struggle, and strives to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. NAHOF has worked in coordination with the Garrett Smith Estate National Historic Landmark, which is also located in Peterborough, New York, to create the Black History Matters series. The following statement is the purpose of Black History Matters. You can read along on the screen. NAHOF supports racial justice movements seeking to address racial inequality, given the resonance with NAHOF's mission to address the second and ongoing abolition to end racism. NAHOF believes a significant number of Americans do not understand the current racial justice protests due to their unfamiliarity with 4 centuries of Black American history because this history was either excluded or taught inadequately in schools. NAHOF knows that education is a powerful step towards ending racism, and that understanding the history of the enslavement and dehumanization of Black Americans provides critical context for the ongoing racial justice movements and the persistence of racism in America. Given NAHOF's commitment to strengthening knowledge of history as one route to confront racism, NAHOF will present Black History Matters, a series of crash courses covering some examples of neglected topics in Black American history throughout the month of February in 2021. So thank you so much for joining me today on my presentation where I will be talking about the Great Migration. The Great Migration was not a singular event and its consequences are very expansive, so I will just give a general overview as to what caused the migration and the impact that it would have on the North. So a basic overview of the Great Migration was that it was a migration of around 6 million Black Americans from the American South to the Northeast, Midwest, and the West areas of the United States in the time span of somewhere around the 1910s to the 1970s. The dates are not really set in stone, but this is generally what people say is what encompassed the Great Migration. The map that you see on this screen illustrates some of these migration patterns by demonstrating the cities to which the migrating populations moved. Some examples, as you can see on the map, of places where these people moved to during this time period are Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New York City, just to name a few. This graphic that you see on the screen shows the different levels of migration based on different decades. This demonstrates that the migration occurred over a long span of time and experienced growth and decline depending on the decade and what was happening at the time. One thing to note is that the biggest migration waves occurred during the decades affected by war. Such as World War I in the 1910s, as you can see on the bar graph, experienced a big growth. As well as the 1920s, which were impacted by increased industrialization from the war. And the biggest migration pattern happened during the 1940s, a time in which the United States was deeply engaged in industry and the manufacturing of machinery and items for war, because obviously we were in World War II. So now it's important to understand the purpose of this migration and what was happening in the South that was not happening in the Northeast, Midwest, and West to cause this giant influx of migrants. So the movement was sparked by a combination of factors. Some of these key factors were the status of Black people in the Jim Crow South, as well as the South's economy in the early mid-1900s. And I will also talk a little bit about how the Jim Crow South and its policies of discrimination, segregation, lack of jobs, and terror inflicted by groups like the KKK caused Black Americans in the South to seek greater political and economic opportunities through jobs in the industrialized parts of the country, which are some of the cities that I mentioned prior. I also wanted to mention that in my discussion of the Great Migration, I will be highlighting some paintings done by Jacob Lawrence, part of his The Migration series that is currently held in the Phillips collection. It is a collection of 60 panels drawn by the artist Jacob Lawrence, who was born on September 7th, 1917, in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and whose family was a product of the Great Migration. Jacob Lawrence was an American painter known for his portrayal of African American historical subjects and contemporary life. Lawrence referred to his style as dynamic cubism. As I mentioned, his art collection is currently displayed online in the Phillips Collection website. I highly recommend you check it out. The link to the website will be linked in the video description. Under each panel in the website, there's explanation as to sort of the artistic elements of the painting, what might have influenced Jacob Lawrence to do that painting in that way, as well as some descriptions of the historical importance, and they give basically a historical background to what each panel is saying. And I think it's honestly one of my favorite art collections and something that really motivated me to learn more about the Great Migration. So definitely do check that out. The first panel, titled During World War I, There Was a Great Migration North by Southern African Americans, introduces the scope and the level of the migration. So this is the first panel, and it just sort of shows the quantity of people that were sort of funneling through train stations and other modes of transport to get to northern cities that were industrialized and had greater access to jobs. So one of the primary pull factors for these migrants from the south to the north was, as I just mentioned, the increase in jobs. There were new booming industries in the north with steel mills, foundries, and factories. And there were labor shortages that encouraged these companies to get rid of their white-only restrictions on hiring, and to actively begin to hunt for workers in the South, particularly Black workers. In this panel titled Migrants Were Advanced Passage on the Railroads, paid for by Northern Industry. Northern Industry was to be repaid by the migrants out of their future wages, illustrates how predatory this practice was. So companies in the North would literally send men down into the South to recruit Black farmers and laborers, offering them better wages in the North and even paying in advance for their train tickets. In a book that I read for a class called Blood on the Forge by William Attaway, this dynamic is illustrated when a man who Southern whites called jacklegs comes to the South and talks to the protagonist, which is a group of three brothers called the Moss Brothers. The Moss Brothers were in that moment in danger because one of the brothers had hit a writing boss who was white and was therefore in fear of his life because he believed he could be lynched for what he did. And the brothers at that moment were also heavily indebted because they were sharecroppers and their crops were failing and they were having some economic hardships. And in the story, the recruiter from the North encounters them in their farm and tells them that they will get good wages in the North, where there are plenty of jobs, and even offers them money in advance so that they will believe him that there is more money to be made in the North. Recruitments of this kind happen all the time in the South because of the vulnerable position that Black people found themselves in these highly discriminatory places, where many were stuck in positions of sharecropping, where they were only growing and growing in depth without actually getting closer to owning land or to owning anything that would actually help them attain any wealth. So this other panel, titled The Labor Agents Sent South by Northern Industry Was a Familiar Presence in Black Communities, illustrates what I was just talking about, that the effort by Northern Industry to recruit Black workers was of particular importance, and therefore they actually sent people to do this recruiting. I want to also talk a little bit about the response that these recruiters had. The Phillips Collection website has underneath this panel a quotation that I'm going to read out loud right now. It says, "Labor agents played a large role in spurring the mass migration of certain Blacks to the industrial North. promising better jobs and educational opportunities. Some agents would even stand on the streets handing out train tickets to young males as incentive to move north. Others were more guarded in their efforts, walking on a crowded street saying, "Anyone want to go to Chicago? See me," to passerby in a low tone. African Americans who were fed up with limited jobs and racism in the South jumped at the chance to improve their situation. Agents soon came under attack by southern states that found their economy struggling and their sources of cheap labor dwindling. Southern sheriffs arrested labor agents and states banned newspaper ads featuring opportunities in the North. End quote. So this just sort of highlights the sheer quantity of recruiting that was going on. That entire places were being sort of being drained of their labor because all these people were moving to the north. And it was so known that there was more jobs in the north that there are people who would jump on the opportunity to be able to go and get a job, especially if they were unemployed or struggling to make ends meet in the South. Although I do want to say that this movement was not a guarantee to a better life. Black migrants continued to face discrimination and lower wages when they arrived at these factories, and even experienced violence at the hands of white immigrants from European countries who had come to work at the factories and whose strikes were being broken by Black migrants, who were being used as a way for factory owners to not have to succumb to strike and union demands. There are many panels in the collection that illustrate the segregation Blacks still encountered in the North, the violence, the bombing of their homes, their being forced to live in crowded tenements, and ill treatment at the hands of the factories that hired them themselves. I won't go that much into detail on the sort of status of these workers when they arrived to the North. I'm mostly just focusing on the movement itself and the impact, but I do want you to keep that in mind because it wasn't a better life per se. It wasn't a guaranteed better life per se if you were to move to the North. The book that I mentioned earlier sort of illustrates this Blood on the Forge because there was actually a lot of workers from European countries like Poland and Italy and Ireland who were working in these factories as well. And oftentimes what happened was that this influx of Black migrants who were getting jobs were actually being used against them. And these workers that were coming from the South obviously didn't know that, but whenever a factory had a group of men, say a group of Irish workers who went on strike, instead of succumbing to their demands, the company would just sort of send recruiters to bring more Black workers. And these Black workers would work for whatever wage was given to them. And without knowing, would actually break the strike because now the factory didn't need the Irish striking workers. So that created even more racial tensions in the areas that these people were moving into. And we see that in some race riots that occurred in northern cities in this time of influx of migrants because of this idea that they were coming in and stealing jobs or um, making it harder for the people that were already there trying to also make a living wage. So the next three panels that you'll see on the screen speak to the environmental reasons that jobs were also failing in the South. And one of the reasons that Black families, especially those that were least likely to have generational wealth to keep them afloat, needed to find jobs elsewhere and therefore made the move to migrate to the North. This panel that you see titled, "Some left because of the promises of work in the North, others left because their farms had been devastated by the floods," illustrates how natural disasters like the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 could destroy over 2,000 square miles of land, ruining homes and crops along the way. I won't go too much into the flooding, but it's worth taking a look into. Black people were treated very, very badly after the flood and were most likely to remain homeless, as well as being forced to work on levees during the flood, in which many of these forced workers actually drowned. The flood also basically obliterated any gains Black Americans might have made in gaining property or businesses because these businesses and property were destroyed by the flood, and also contributed to the already heavy tensions regarding race relations in the South. When refugees, there were actually a lot of refugee camps set up for these people that were fleeing the flood or had been ousted from their homes by the flood. These refugee camps were actually segregated, and there was hugely different treatment of people who were staying at a refugee camp for Black Americans versus a refugee camp for white Southerners. There were also issues of forced unpaid labor of Black Americans and unequal distribution of food, like I just said, in many of these refugee camps. After the flood waters receded, thousands of these families were still left homeless, and therefore many decided to leave the South forever and seek a better life in the North. So the Great Migration actually accelerated the amount of migrants from the South to the North because it created horrible conditions for these families in the South. The image that you see on the screen is of a refugee camp near the Louisiana Monument during the Great Flood of 1927. The treatment of Black refugees after a natural disaster then and after the flood is actually very similar to the treatment of Black Americans that we saw after Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana in our own times. So we sort of see some of these patterns are still here, especially in the South. Additionally, another push factor from the South was the boll weevil, which was basically an insect that destroyed many jobs in the South by destroying the cotton production of farmers, many of whom were Black sharecroppers, basically making it impossible for them to pay their debts, as well as making the economic situation all the more worse in the South. Because the South was very reliant on cotton. As you've probably heard in a lot of places, cotton was called king because it was just such a big crop and had such a big role in the economy of entire regions in the South. This panel that you see on the screen is titled, "They Left Because the Boll Weevil Had Ravaged the Cotton Crop." So politically and socially, there were also a lot of reasons for migrants to move to the North. I just covered some environmental reasons, but obviously there were some that had more to do with the treatment of Black Americans in the South itself. So as you've probably seen in previous presentations in the Black History Matters series, even when whites provoked violence against Blacks, such as the case in Wilmington, North Carolina, or Hamburg, we sort of see, or even in the presentation that you will see tomorrow, which will be on the Tulsa Massacre, we see that certain courts almost never uphold the protection of Black people's rights. This panel titled, "For African Americans, There Was No Justice in Southern Courts," highlights the sense of powerlessness felt by those facing the court and its systems of law. This next panel, which is titled, "There Were Lynchings," it's a very short title in comparison to the others, but equally as powerful, illustrates another sense of injustice experienced by Black Southerners in the uncontrolled mob's reign of terror on Black communities, but unprovoked lynchings of Black people. We also see how this we also see how this illustrates the decision to move, because according to the NAACP, thousands of lynchings took place between 1882 and 1968, mostly of Blacks and mostly in the South. During that period, there were some 581 lynchings in Mississippi, 531 in Georgia, and 493 in Texas alone. And these are obviously only the ones that are recorded, because there were many that occurred that have never been recorded or registered. In this cartoon here that you see on the screen also illustrates how this violence was a main contributor to the movement of people from the South to the North. Likewise, other forms of discrimination, like the policy of separate but equal, which was obviously never equal, and the lack of education for Black children, as well as the restrictions of rights of citizenship, like the lack of voting access because of discriminatory laws in the South, in Jim Crow South, that prevented Black people from voting, even though Black men had the right guaranteed to them in the Reconstruction Amendment. So these were the primary motives for moving from the South to the North. However, I do also want to emphasize the powerful role that Black media played in promoting the migration and the impact that it had on the North and South, as well as on American culture itself. The Great Migration was also spurred by Black newspapers, as well as who saw that the benefits of life for Black Americans in the North were actually a lot better than in the South. This panel, titled "The Black Press Urged the People to Leave the South," demonstrates how individuals were informed about the Great Migration and the benefits of moving north through reading the newspapers published by Black press, like the Chicago Defender. This panel, titled "In Many of the Communities the Black Press was read with great interest, it encouraged the movement," demonstrates how entire communities relied on the information that newspapers gave them to make their decisions about migrating. The panel reads, "African Americans living in the South read about the better conditions in the North via several Black newspapers, the most prominent being the Chicago Defender and the Amsterdam News. The publications played a major role in influencing many African Americans to leave their Southern homes for the job and educational opportunities in the North promoted by these papers." So as you can see, Black newspapers were very important. The Chicago Defender, which is now called the Chicago Daily Defender, was founded in 1905 by Robert Abbott. It features news, editorials, and political cartoons, as well as promoting Chicago as a destination for people seeking to make the Great Migration. The other newspaper that was mentioned is the Amsterdam News, which was first published in 1909 by James Anderson. This paper covered Harlem community social news, but later expanded to talk a little bit more about national news. And the following cartoon that you see on the screen is an example of one published in the Chicago Defender that demonstrates how Black Americans were making the decision to leave the South due to the conditions that made their lives difficult in the places that they found themselves in the South. And this cartoon was published by the Chicago Defender on April 7th of 1917. Another important source of information, as a side note, is also family members. Those family members that made the journey north would often write back to their families that were still in the South, telling them to come to the North because of the better situation that they would find there, as well as more economic opportunities. So therefore, letter writing was also very important for the decision-making process for many people. Obviously, this mass movement of Black Americans was not good for the South. Southern whites began to imprison Northern recruiters, as I mentioned earlier, threaten their Black residents, and especially those who worked as sharecroppers. They purposely arrested people at train stations as they were trying to leave, to make them miss their train so that they could not leave. And this was particularly bad because many people could barely afford the train's fees to make it to the North. And if they missed their trains, it would be almost impossible, or it would take them a very long time to get the necessary fees to pay for another train ticket. This was because this decision to sort of harass people to not leave was mostly because entire fields were being left without workers as people left certain places en masse. When a community began to experience the migration of its Black residents, others were keen to follow. When a Black family, when a member of a family, for example, left, usually the rest of his family would accompany later if that individual had found a good, secure job and a place to live. And it was also more likely that the rest of the community would decide to make that movement. For example, Black professionals like lawyers and doctors also left once the community started to leave because they were following their clientele. If they catered towards Black Southerners, then they would have to follow that community wherever they went because that was their way of making money. However, this type of coercion by certain whites to prevent outmigration could only work so much. And as we saw in the data itself, around 6 million people ended up making this journey anyways. The panel that you see on the screen is called "To Make It Difficult for the Migrants to Leave, They Were Arrested en Masse. They Often Missed Their Trains," which speaks to what I just said earlier about them physically trying to restrain people from leaving by arresting them at train stations. The last thing I wanted to speak about was the effect of the Great Migration on American culture. The Great Migration led to the creation of cultural hubs like Harlem and New York, where we saw the birth of the Harlem Renaissance And it also led to the congregation of Black intellectuals, politicians, writers, and activists in places like Chicago and other northern cities. In fact, many of the texts that I read in my English classes that spoke about the profound impact on culture by the Great Migration were written by authors who were reflecting on the impacts of the Great Migration, either on their own lives or because they were born in northern cities where they saw the impact of this migration. Some examples are Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, Jazz by Toni Morrison, and the text that I mentioned, Blood on the Forge by William Attaway. And Jacob Lawrence himself, the person who made all these panels, was also reflecting on the migration and its impacts through his art, as he recounts in an interview that he made for the collection, how he himself moved around the country a lot with his family in his youth as a part of the Great Migration, and thus it was a big part of his life. So tomorrow we will be having a presentation on the Tulsa Massacre, which will serve as another example of the kind of violence that promoted the mass migration of which we just spoke. But we will also have an in-depth conversation about housing inequality by Dr. Hartshorn in a few days, which will speak a little bit more about what happened to these Black Americans once they made it to northern cities. I will also be having a discussion about A Raisin in the Sun, which is a play by Lorraine Hansberry, which delves into how housing discrimination policies in South Chicago affected the abilities of social mobility for Black Americans, which is another big part of the story of what happens in the Great Migration after they make it to their final destination. So I hope you join us in that discussion. I do have some closing statements that I would like to go through with you. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, I have curated a list of references and sources that you can visit, and that will be available in the video description. I will also ask you to fill out a quick survey linked in the video description as well that will help us gather feedback about the specific topic. This survey will take you no more than 5 minutes and will provide us with valuable information that will help us in the formation of future presentations like this one. Should you have any questions regarding the presentation itself, I have made my email available so that you may contact me with any questions or even comments. Additionally, please do contact NAHOF if you have any questions or if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. NAHOF's information is on the screen. I'd like to thank you for joining me in this presentation today, and I hope that you do check out some of the resources that I made available either in the reference list or just suggested during the video, because it's a great topic that had a great impact on American society. Please remember that we will be releasing a new video each day this February of 2021, and we hope to see you at our next presentation. Thank you.